All right, so we're going to go to chapter 24 here, planning, zoning, and building ordinances. So this in your book is on page 465. So in this chapter here, a lot of what we discuss and a lot of what we talk about has to do with what we generally term police powers. And what police powers are there any public or any governmental restrictions on what you can and cannot do with your property. And the easiest way really to describe police power is just really anything where the government can restrict what you freely do with your property. So if I buy a property in a neighborhood, let's say a neighborhood next to the school, I can't just say I'm going to buy the single family home, knock it down, and build an office building. Why can't I do that? Because of the police power zoning. Zoning is going to tell me what I can put in that area. Perhaps maybe it's only a residential single family use, no higher than 28 feet. Got to have setback lines, 12 feet from my neighbor's property line and things like that. And we'll talk about those terms in this chapter here. But the first term to just generally know for this chapter is a lot of what we talk about is police powers. And police powers are any public or any governmental restrictions on what an owner can and cannot do with their property. And again, a police powers is not just like police. It would be like things like police, fire codes, eminent domain, condemnation, zoning, taxation, escheat, building codes, you know, all that kind of stuff. All of that really falls underneath the term police power here. So in this first paragraph you'll see on page 465, it's not bolded, but you'll see number 1 on the third line there is the term eminent domain. Eminent domain is the government's right to take private property for the public use with paying you just compensation. And the just compensation is fair market value of the property. So the government's right, for instance, that they, could take your property. Maybe they want to build a new state highway, and your house is sitting right in the middle where they want to put that state highway. They have the right to take your property and put in a state highway. Their right to take your property we call eminent domain. Their action, when they actually move forward and take it, we call that condemnation. So the government's right to take your property is called eminent domain. Their action, when they actually take it, we call that condemnation. So eminent domain is the government's right to take private property for the public use, just compensation paid, and condemnation is the government's action of taking private property for the public use, just compensation paid. So again, one is the right and one is the act. Next here, number 2, still in that first paragraph, you have this term here, escheat. What escheat is, escheat would be if you were to die intestate, that means you die without a will. If you die without a will and you have no family to pass your property on to, it would then go to the government, and we call that escheat. So the term escheat means to die intestate, which means you die without a will, and you have no heirs to pass your property on to, and then goes to the government, and we call that term escheat. 3 and 4, taxation and police power. We talked about police power already. We have a whole chapter on real estate taxes, so I'm not going to go into that now. But as you move along to the bottom left here of this page, you have the section titled Planning. And planning and zoning boards, typically operate hand in hand. So, like the town puts out this master plan, and this term master plan is bolded on the top right here of 465. And the master plan tells you what you can and cannot have in those areas. So, like a master plan, to give you an example, when you build a house, right, you don't just build a house and say, this looks good here, this looks good there. You have a blueprint for what you want the house to look like. The town has a much larger blueprint. This much larger blueprint we call the master plan. So the master plan is like the blueprint for what they want the town to look like. So they might say, perhaps maybe on the test, which of the following would best describe a blueprint for the development of lands in a town, and that's your master plan. Your master plan is this big blueprint for what they want the town to look like. And if we turn the page and go to 466 here, 466 on the left side, you'll see this first bolded term here, a buffer zone. So what is a buffer zone? A buffer zone is used to separate 2 incompatible zoning districts. If you have a commercial area next to a residential area, you're going to have a buffer zone in between. Now, this buffer zone, it's not like, there's a sign that says this is a buffer zone. A buffer zone could be something natural, could be man-made. It could be trees, it could be an empty patch of land, it could be a fence, it could be a wall. It could be like on the highway, on the side there, that blocks the highway from the neighborhood there. They have the sound barriers. Maybe that's another example of a buffer zone. But generally speaking, what a buffer zone, is used to do, it's used to separate 2 incompatible zoning districts. And then on the left side here of 466, we talk about subdivisions. Now, a subdivision is the taking of one property and chopping it into multiple properties. So again, a subdivision is when you take one property and divide it into multiple properties. We call that a subdivision. So the subdivision is the dividing up of one parcel of land into a number of smaller lots. So if I were to take one plot of, let's say, 3 acres and chop it into 3 separate 1-acre lots, that would be me subdividing. So subdividing is, again, taking one parcel of land and chopping it into a number of smaller lots. And then also listed here towards the bottom left, we have the term setback line. So in regards to setback line, we say these are imaginary lines within which you cannot build. So setback lines, they are imaginary lines within which you cannot build. So for example, let's say the setback line of my property is 15 feet. So 15 feet side yard requirement, which means that my structure cannot be within 15 feet of my neighbor's property line. And if I wanted to go beyond that, if I wanted to be, let's say, within 10 feet of my neighbor's property line, I have to apply for permission to do something that violates zoning. We call that applying for a variance, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You might have a front yard requirement. The front of your house cannot be within 20 feet of the curb or other established line. That's also another form of the setback line. But again, what a setback line is, it's an imaginary line within which you cannot build. Next here, towards the bottom left of 466, talks about an environmental impact statement. Now, this environmental impact statement, before you break ground on new construction, you were supposed to have this done. And this environmental impact statement, it's not like just testing the proposed impact of your construction of your new home on, like, the water quality, soil quality, air quality. It tests a lot of things. What will the proposed impact be on the water quality, soil quality, air quality, but also the traffic patterns, the road width? Do they have to add in a stop sign? Do they have to add in a stop light? Do they have to, depending on how big it is, do they have to hire more police officers? Do they have to add a fire truck? Because if it's like a big 300, 400 unit subdivision, they might, have to obviously hire more teachers and things like that. Do they have to do something to rework the sewer and water system? So these are all the, factors that get taken into consideration here. But when you would have to have this done is before breaking ground on new construction. Now, if you're doing it for like a single family home, you can apply for a waiver. And odds are you'll probably be granted that, because really the intention of this is, if this construction is big, let's say like, 100 unit, subdivision, 200 unit, 300 unit, 400 unit, there's going to be a lot of kids moving into there perhaps, and maybe they have to make some expansion on the school. They have to add a couple police officers to, patrol that area. It depends where you are, what price points, what area of the state, obviously, too. But environmental impact statement must be done before breaking ground on new construction. All right, and then towards the bottom right here of 466 talks about zoning. So zoning really tells you what you can and cannot have in certain areas. So zoning will tell me, like, this area is residential, this is commercial, this is agricultural, this is, industrial, so on and so forth. So you'll have different zones, and in these different zones you can have different uses. Now, for the purpose of zoning, if they were to say, like, for instance, if you read paragraph 2 here on the bottom right under zoning, it says the zoning statute states that the purpose of zoning is to really do things like lessen congestion in the streets, secure safety from fire, flood, or panic, promote health and general morals in the area and things like that. So again, you don't want to have like the overcrowding of land and buildings. So they could ask you perhaps, which of the following is in place to prevent the overcrowding of land and buildings? It's zoning. Zoning basically tells you what you can and cannot have in certain areas. And then on page 467, we talk here about things like nonconforming uses. So what are nonconforming uses? Because it goes hand in hand with zoning. A nonconforming use is a use of property that was lawfully established prior to the enactment of a new zoning ordinance that causes the current use to conflict with zoning. So to give you an example of that, let's say perhaps you had a soda factory. And the soda factory, when it was originally built in the 1960s, was all good. It was no problem. You had this beautiful soda factory. Years down the road, though, you built this in 1970. In 1990, the town comes in, and the town says, we're going to rezone this neighborhood where the soda factory is located to be residential use. We only want single-family homes here. Now, the town doesn't knock on my door as a soda factory and say, hey, you guys got to close up shop. This is now a residential area. But what the town does do, they knock on my door and say, hey, listen, just so you know, we just rezoned this area as a residential single-family use. Don't worry, you don't have to close up shop. You're going to be grandfathered in. You're grandfathered in as a pre-existing non-conforming use. You're allowed to stay here as long as you do stay as the same use. However, if you were to sell to somebody and they wanted to perhaps, build an apartment building, convert your factory into an apartment building, they can't do that. However, if you want to sell to somebody and they want to keep the same use as you had, that's okay. They're also grandfathered in. Or if you want to sell to somebody who's going to perhaps knock down your factory and build single-family homes, that's okay, because we're now allowing single-family homes. But what we just want to let you know is that you as the current owner, as it stands, we're not telling you to shut down. You're going to be grandfathered in to our new zoning regulation as a pre-existing non-conforming use. So, again, what a non-conforming use is, it's a use of property that was lawfully established prior to the enactment of a new zoning ordinance, and the current use that you have, the soda factory in my example, no longer conforms with the current zoning regulations, but you're grandfathered in, and you're allowed to stay there as a pre-existing non-conforming use. So, for the non-conforming use, here's one of the unfortunate things. Let's say, for example, the building's destroyed, and it could even be because of arson. One of your employees got mad at you, and they torched the building, and they lit the building on fire, and the building burned down. I can't just automatically rebuild that building. They treat me as anybody else. They treat me as if I'm just trying to build, just a random factory out of nowhere. I would have to apply for a variance, because now what I'm seeking to do is rebuild something that violates zoning. And when you apply for a variance, what you're seeking to do is you're applying for permission to do something that violates zoning. So they might ask you, if you wanted to apply for permission to do something that violates zoning, what would you apply for? You'd apply for a variance. When you apply for a variance, you're applying for permission to do something that violates zoning. All right, and let's turn and go to the next page here, page 468. So on 468, on the right side here, it talks about the Mount Laurel decision. Now, for the Mount Laurel decision, one of the most important things the Mount Laurel decision wound up ultimately creating was the Council of Affordable Housing. Because the Mount Laurel decision was basically a decision that went down in South Jersey years and years ago that basically said that every town has to meet their fair share of affordable housing obligations. Now, there's all different numbers involved with this for what is deemed, affordable housing, towns' requirements for affordable housing and things of that sort. But the main thing that, I would say to take away in this quick recap video is that the Mount Laurel decision created the Council of Affordable Housing ultimately. And then on the left side of 469, we talk here about planned unit developments. So for a planned unit development, what is that? That's your condo complex, your townhouse complex, maybe a co-op complex, maybe a gated community of single-family homes, right? That's a planned unit development. Now, in these planned unit developments, since we're in the zoning chapter here, what they allow for is cluster zoning. Normally, let's say perhaps in town, the setback requirement is that your neighbor's house must be, let's say, 15 feet from your property line. But we know in a townhouse complex, your unit is going to be attached to your neighbor. The town allows cluster zoning in this circumstance because what they say is that by not having space between the two properties, this will open up open space somewhere in the community where you can have things like your pool, your tennis court, basketball court, workout facility, clubhouse, so on and so forth. So everybody in the community is going to benefit from that because you have those uses. So for these planned unit developments, they might ask you also, like, what are the rules in there? The rules we call the bylaws. The bylaws are the rules and regulations of a condo or townhome community. So if they were to ask you which of the following best describes the rules and regulations of a condo or townhome community, we call that the bylaws. The bylaws tell you what you can and cannot do. All right, and then on the top right here of 469, it talks about building codes. So in regards to building codes, what do building codes do? They set minimum construction standards for buildings in the state. So if they were to ask you which of the following would set minimum construction standards for buildings in the state, that's building codes. So again, building codes, they would set minimum construction standards. So this way when somebody buys a house, they have at least a small little level of assurance that they're not buying a house that's going to blow down if the wind comes too strong one night. Again, what building codes do, they set minimum construction standards for buildings in the state. All right, and if you turn here and go to page 470, 470 towards the bottom left talks about carbon monoxide and smoke detectors. So what I would say to know about these is that they must be located on every single level of the home within 10 feet of all bedrooms. So carbon monoxide and smoke detectors must be located on every single level of the home within 10 feet of all sleeping areas. Now, new construction code, I doubt they ask this, but in case they do, new construction code says these carbon monoxide and smoke detectors must be hardwired as well. Can't just be battery operated. In other words, like just plug-in and stuff like that. So new construction code says they must be hardwired, but just the general overview of this is that carbon monoxide and smoke detectors, where must they be located? Every level of the home within 10 feet of all bedrooms, of all sleeping areas. And then towards the bottom left here of 470, child protection window guards. So what are these? These things look like jail cells, basically. They're put on the windows so that if you have a small child, they don't lean out the window, fall, and get hurt, or perhaps even die. For these child protection window guards, the regulation for this is that if you as a landlord have a tenant that is a child aged 10 or younger, upon written request from that tenant, you must provide, maintain, and install these window guards. So again, upon written request from this tenant, you must provide, maintain, and install these window guards. You would have to give them a notification along with the lease that says if you do have a child aged 10 or younger, upon written request, you may ask us to provide, maintain, and install window guards for you, and we would have to do that for you. And that's what this talks about here. Then on the right side here of 470, it talks about fire extinguishers. Now, when you go to get your continuing certificate of occupancy when you're selling a home, the towns do require you have a fire extinguisher in that home. And there's all these regulations with that too. The fire extinguisher has to be a certain fire extinguisher, which is listed in the book here under the bullet points. It's got to be no older than 10 years old. It's got to be fully charged. It's got to be visible and hung in brackets, meaning like, for example, you can't have it under your sink. You can't have it closed off in your pantry. You cannot have it behind your cellar door. It's supposed to be visible either in the kitchen or within 10 feet of the kitchen and bracketed on the wall. Now, bracketed on the wall, you'll see one of these bullet points here. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th one down. It can't be more than 5 feet above the floor either. So you can't have it like bracketed on the ceiling, obviously, because what use would that do if a fire breaks out? So for these fire extinguishers, those are just some of the regulations. They got to be within eyesight, either in the kitchen, within 10 feet of the kitchen, and bracketed no more than 5 feet off the ground. So that's a recap here for chapter 24. As always, if any of you students have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is kylekovats@gmail.com. Thank you.